My talk is called Time for Action, or it's labeled Time for Action. But I think that we know that now is the time to act. And I think that the speakers you're going to hear from later on will make clear what action we need to take. So I'm going to take a step back, and I'm going to ask, why act at all? What's at stake? Why are wild salmon worth saving? As I do so, I might make the not-so-subtle suggestion that storytelling has an important supporting role to play as we push forward with bold new solutions. So, let me start by telling you some stories. I learned to fish for salmon in a place called Juniper, New Brunswick. That's on the north branch of the main southwest Miramichi River. It's quite a mouthful. Up that far, it's more of a headwater stream, not really a river. And salmon have to travel over 200 kilometers from the salt to get there. As a boy, I'd fish with my father on summer evenings. We walked through the shallows without waders, the water just coming up to our knees. The alders hung low over the dark water, and the birds filled the night with their song. Up in the headwater reaches, the stream twists and turns, threatens to cut an oxbow at every bend. Signs of human interference in the ecosystem are few and far between. The place seems to stand almost outside of time itself. And on those warm summer evenings, I learned that in the deep pockets and dark corners lies hidden the soul of the river. Now, the anglers among you won't be surprised to hear that it took me some time and effort to connect with that hidden magic. Nor will you be surprised to hear that when I finally did, it was transformative. Connected to such powerful and athletic fish through only light tackle, the incredible wildness and vitality of Atlantic salmon seems somehow to transmit directly into the angler. Holding an Atlantic salmon in your hands before a successful release, you can easily be overcome by just how beautiful the natural world is. Flesh and blood like us, salmon are also a thing apart, wild, untamed, their soul a thing unknowable. The feeling of a connection, however fleeting, fills us with a sense of richness and meaning. Let it suffice to say that that feeling has not ceased to be one of the motivating forces in my life. So you can imagine my dismay as fewer and fewer salmon return to our rivers each year. You've heard the numbers, and you anglers know that each year we work harder and harder to catch fewer and fewer fish. But really, I don't want to make it about catching less fish. It's about looking at a river you love and knowing that its lifeblood is vanishing before your eyes. Yes, salmon are a key link between the freshwater and saltwater ecosystems. Yes, they perform a myriad of essential ecological roles. Yes, they're treasured sport fish. But most of all, salmon are the soul of a river, and a river that's lost its salmon has lost its soul. It's happened in too many places already, and now I'm watching it happen on my home waters. But what's a failed political philosopher turned struggling writer to do about it? Well, a couple of years ago, I teamed up with wildlife photographer Nick Hawkins, who, like me, has been fishing salmon on the Miramichi for his entire life. We fished a bit, we threw some ideas back and forth, and we decided, what better way to show our river than travel its entire length? So we dropped the boat in the water in the far reaches of the headwaters. 10 days and 170 kilometers later, we pulled out, not far from the head of tide. We saw many faces of the great river, from the sacred alder grounds in the headwaters to difficult stretches with rocks and rapids that were lined with dense spruce forest that seemed to go on forever, to this lush floodplain of silver maple. We shared the river with deer, moose, bears. At night, we listened to the haunting calls of the owls and once even heard a red fox kit crying for its mother. The river beamed with life and wonder. But one thing was certainly in short supply. At that time of year, covering that much water, fishing all the time, we would have, just a few generations ago, caught dozens of salmon. Yet they were very few and far between. Here and there, as we drifted downstream, I caught sight of one as it slipped upriver past the canoe. By and large, though, we saw that they had become ghosts in their own home. That, of course, made the few that we did get all the more special. We landed this fish on a very remote stretch of the river. We were surrounded in every direction by swaths of coniferous forest. Not another not another living human for miles and miles. The salmon was bright and fresh, probably just hours from the salt. The sheer wildness of the fish and the place washed over us, the opalescence of its gill plate, its polished and muscular form. We sensed the salmon looking at us, and we gazed back, peering for just an instant into its very essence, that alterity, that otherness that we'll never truly know, and for that reason enchants us all the more. It was a moment that made the story of our journey. With images and words, we were able to convey what the river and its fish mean to us, just how special they are. And in addition, as is sometimes the case in those moments that give us pause, something changed. Not just in the way we saw Atlantic salmon, but in how we wanted to tell stories about them. That is, we started to see the potential to show salmon not just as impressive sport fish, but as wildlife, to show Atlantic salmon entirely in themselves. Photographically, that's not a feat that's often been accomplished, so we need to change gears and do something different entirely. The crystal clear waters of the Gaspé rivers in Quebec offer some of the most promising conditions. After the fishing season closed, we put away our rods, packed the truck with gear, and headed north. The weather conditions were somewhat trying. Here's Gaspé's Dartmouth River, and that's just late October. But we did push on, moving from pool to pool, hauling a seemingly endless quantity of gear, often camping out on the riverbank. Sometimes it meant spending a full 6 or 8 hour day in the frigid water. There's Nick, and you can see several large salmon in the pool there. I don't want you to think that we suffered too much. There was always time for a cup of tea between photo shoots. And eventually, the hard work started to pay off. We were capturing and sharing some new and unforgettable perspectives of Atlantic salmon. Here are some salmon in the St. Jean River's Bluff Pool. In this image, the hens' bellies are almost bursting with eggs. Of course, while we were making these images, we were also watching the fish the whole time. We observed them travel energetically around the pool, shooting its length with what seemed like merely the flick of a tail. We watched the males rake one another with open mouths and chase each other around the pool, competing for position beside the females. It seemed like we came to know their individual temperaments, which ones were friendly, curious, which were more circumspect. This big guy was very curious. I'm not sure if friendly is the term, but he always came over to have a look, maybe territorial. Now, we didn't speculate, as might be natural to us, what it would be like to angle for these fish. Instead, we started to wonder what it might be like to be one of these fish, who had swum all the way to Greenland and back to complete the species' life cycle in that self-same spawning gravel from which they themselves were delivered. We'll never know, of course, what that would be like, but we gained an empathy for and closeness to these fish that we'd not felt before. In late October last year, we were on Quebec's York River, and in a place called White House Pool, we found about 40 salmon. The water was gin clear and the banks were steep, so we could see clearly into the pool. When we came back a few days later for a photo shoot, a thick layer of ice had formed on the river's surface. Not to be deterred, we suited up and broke through the ice. As my head went under, the freezing water took my breath, and I thought for a minute about turning around. But I persisted and kicked through a small channel until the river opened up into a large basin pool. White House is shaped like an upside-down pyramid, a gravel bank on one side, a sheer bank of bedrock on the other, and ice above our heads. The pool was almost like an inverted basilica, a truly magnificent setting. And yes, we shared it with those 40 salmon. They darted away at first, but soon got used to our presence. We swam almost close enough to touch them, although I held back the urge to reach out a hand. I could see in perfect clarity just how graceful and efficient are their movements. They'd taken on their dark spawning colors, but every once in a while, as one passed by me, I could still see a bright flash of silver on its flank. And just like that impressive fish we caught on the Miramichi, I sensed the piercing gaze of these salmon. It felt like they were looking right into me, and not with fear, but with curiosity. In that icy underwater cathedral, I felt closer than ever to the wild essence of Atlantic salmon. For the first time, I saw them purely in themselves, where they're supposed to be, doing what they're supposed to do, just being salmon. It was a nearly transcendent feeling. My sense of a connection to the species, their ecosystems, and the struggles they now face had never been stronger. Okay, I'm going to switch gears a bit, and thank you for sitting patiently while I've gone on and on about myself. Why is any of this important for Atlantic salmon? Well, I've conveyed, I hope, my deep personal connection to the species. And I'm certainly not the only one who feels that way. If salmon continue to disappear from our rivers, it will be not just an ecological loss, but one for us as well. But here's the truth. Most people will never pick up a salmon rod. Fewer still will torture themselves for a chance to swim with them, or make salmon a central part of their lives in some other way, as advocates or as researchers. But the public at large, the general viewership, still has space in their lives for Atlantic salmon. What they're missing is some kind of connection. In other words, people need to care about Atlantic salmon. Don't get me wrong, salmon have lots going for them. Cutting-edge research that you're going to hear about, passionate advocates from NGOs, generous, committed sponsors. But right now, they need everything. They're in a crisis. Once things go past a certain point, recovery becomes very, very difficult and slow. There is no doubt that now is the time for action. It's time to increase our existing efforts. It's time for bold new strategies like the ones you're going to hear about from later speakers. And it also means that salmon need a strong public image. Atlantic salmon are disappearing not just from our rivers, but also from our collective field of view. They're magnificent and charismatic animals with a compelling and dramatic natural history. There's no reason they can't stand beside humpback whales or polar bears or even Pacific salmon as species that have captured the hearts of the public. But people don't just need to know about Atlantic salmon. They need to find them meaningful. They need to love the species. They need to feel that the disappearance of the species is a real loss for us and for the planet. Here's the key thing. When people feel that way, the prerogative to protect salmon becomes immeasurably stronger. It gives critical support and license for conservation measures. But how do we create that connection with the species? What is it that viewers need? They need powerful images of salmon. They need stories about salmon. They need stories about people who love salmon. Successful conservation storytelling doesn't merely show nature as it is or offer a glimpse of how it once was. Stories, the words and images, show how nature could be again. Strong, compelling narratives that readers can identify with convey not just the reality that we can turn things around, but they create that very much needed sense of hope that we can do it. Here are my final thoughts. I've been hearing for my entire life that there were so many more salmon back in the day. And you know what? The same people who say that to me heard it from the generation that came before them, and so on and so forth. It's a symptom of shifting baseline syndrome. But today, our baseline has become untenably low. This is our last chance to break that cycle. I've got 2 young boys back home in Halifax. I can't wait to spend time on the water with them when they get a little older, to cultivate in them a love of salmon and salmon rivers. But I don't want to tell them it's not as good as it used to be. I want to tell them that it's getting better, that we've turned things around. There is no reason that we can't. It's not going to be easy. It's going to take a lot of collaboration, effort, and resources. But it's going to be that much easier if we have stories that tell us we can do it. Thank you.